thank you for to the organizer to this conference for having me here, and thank you for all of you to wait till this late to listen to what I have to say. I'm not a linguist typologist, so you're going to hear a paper which is completely different from what we have heard all day today. But it's still related to Oceanic Polynesian language, and but my take on language and semantics and cognition is slightly different from what we have heard so far, which I've learned a lot in this last 3-4 days, and that's the reason why I came here from Chicago, 24 hours flying. Anyway, many things did not work, but it seems like at least now I can manually advance this presentation. So, methodological issues in investigating the linguistic expression of quality in Tongan. So the first thing to ask is, well, of course, you know, all of you know what Tongan is. This is a slide for context in which people don't know what Tongan is. So I just skip that. So the question to ask is why focus on quality? I apologize for the font, because it's not my font. It's just the font that the computer decides to put on there. Anyway, whenever you change from systems, something weird happens. Anyway, in my publication of 2009, I proposed the following linguistic metaphor for culture, or that is to say, cultural models in mind. That is to say, you start from foundational cultural model in ontological domains or ontological primes, and then you flesh them out in the next stage, and you obtain molar cultural models. And then those molar cultural models do not directly produce behavior, but they participate in the construction of behavior. And so in the same way, like you have syntax, phonology, and speech, basically. Oh, wait a second. Sorry. So notice that I have already investigated domains like space, time, possession, relationships, but there are two very important ones that are left out, and they're all domains, of course, which are universal. But you know, I investigated them in Tongan, not in any other language, you know, or culture. And there are two ones that are left out, which is quantity and quality. You start to understand where I'm going. You know, there is some literature about quantity already in the Tongan and Austronesian languages, and we also heard Malcolm report about that, work in progress on that. So there was no need to replicate that kind of work, and I will probably capitalize on that very soon, okay? So I decided to focus on quality as the next relevant Tongan ontological domain to investigate. Basically, my goal at the end of my career will be that of having the ontological domain of one language and one culture covered in as much as possible in its entirety. Yeah, I mean, of course, entirety is a kind of a pretentious word, but somewhat, you know, you investigate the most important primes. So, what are the methodological issues here that I'm dealing with? First, they relate to the theoretical position. Well, let me try to see if I can read them here on the computer. The theoretical position one chooses, then the theory just always dictates and generates a specific methodology. And two, the fundamental characteristic of the language under investigation. So I address the first issues by adopting cultural model theory in my, you know, dealing with this research. By the way, this research is started only last year, so it's a preliminary. The results that I'm presenting are preliminary, and I'm working on it basically, and that's why I came here to get help by people. Then. By adopting cultural model theory, I chose to look at linguistic behavior as instantiating cognitive preferences. Regarding the second issue of linguistic characteristic of the language, you know, according to Brochard and other researchers, it appears that lexical morphemes in Tongan become parts of speech, to say adjective, nouns, verbs, whatever, only when appearing in a syntactic construction, it is to say a sentence, and they're not defined as such in the lexicon. So they're kind of indefinite. So basically this idea refers to what you are very familiar with, the fact that Polynesian languages and fundamentally, and oceanic languages for that matter, they deal with these parts of speech and lexemes in a very, let's say, kind of free way. You know, they just move things around and they make them become what they want in that moment. In the sentence production, of course. So issue of cultural model, cultural model theory. What is cultural model theory? And this is probably the part that this audience is going to be a little more unfamiliar with. So, as with any theory, cultural model theory is based on some axiom assumption from which we can deduce or derive theorems or inferences. What are the axioms? Culture is in the mind of individuals, which for you may seem normal or acceptable or reasonable or logical, but in anthropology, this issue is controversial, okay? People have made proposals which are really kind of strange. But anyway, mind consists of processes and mental representations. Mental representation have content and realize or induce processes. So there is a relationship between the content and the processes in the mind. Mental representation are models of reality. That is to say, they represent a reduction of what reality is, but they preserve the structure of this reality in order to be of any use, and that is why they are called models, all right? Thus, the models are structured and organized so that they can replicate the structure that they are representing. They consist of there you go. The thing just go wherever they want here on this computer. Anyway, they consist of units and relationship. That's what a structure is. And the relationship could be sequential, taxonomic, causal, etc. They are made of a core part and a periphery, this mental representation, these mental models. The periphery comes into contact with context, and this is a fundamental way of thinking about mental models in cognitive science by Minsky in 1978, 80. It's very, very common. Nonetheless, the periphery is sensible to input from context, and so it can change its values. So, but even if the context does not provide values, the periphery has values, which are default values, okay? So mental representation also are out of awareness. We are not aware of this mental representation. So mental representation may also be nested into each other. This is a very important assumption. So what do we do with this assumption? We start making some inferences. Mental models become cultural models when they're shared in a community. Okay, so they're mental models, but they're shared in a community, so they are cultural models. They also must be transmitted, etc. But there are two types of cultural model. Foundational one, which are the ontological domain that I mentioned at the beginning, and molar cultural models, a larger one which incorporate different type of knowledge. There is individual variation in any community due to the nature of this cultural model, which are interacting with context for each individual in a different way. So you have the ontogenesis of these models, this knowledge construction, basically. Variation in the community for similar reason, because subgroups interact with the environment in different ways, in a more collective way, okay? Cultural model are the units of culture. They are the units of investigation. Cultural model function as mental lenses in understanding, in reasoning, in planning action, and many motivates or generate action. Okay, this approach to culture model and mental models and language requires a specific type of methodology in which you need ethnographic knowledge, you need linguistic knowledge, and you need cognitive data knowledge, which basically lead to collection of data that are analyzed both qualitatively and quantitatively. Now, I have 2 slides about what is the methodology and how it proceeds, but I'm going to skip them, right? I'm just going to go very quickly. There's a first, second data stage. I'm going to skip this because it's too much. Otherwise, I'll never finish and we'll never go to dinner, all right? So So adopting cultural model theory then implies, among other things, that by examining linguistic behavior, one can arrive at specific cognitive preferences that participate in the construction of that behavior. Within cultural model theory, one could hypothesize the participation of foundational cultural model as a radiality to the construction of cognitive representation and linguistic expression of quality distinction for things or object. Object capitalized, meaning any cognitive object in the world, abstract, concrete, or whatever. And so only if you have that theory as an adopted theory, then you can conceptualize this second step. So the question is, okay, radiality. What is radiality, right? I've written about that before, but then I'm going to just quickly, I only have one slide about that. In the most abstract form, radiality is a structural organization in which a number of vectors share a common origin that may also function as ending point for all these vectors. Two cases are possible. Common origin is ego, or common origin is the other than ego. I decided to call radiality the second case. A point in the field of ego is chosen to function as the source goal of a number of relationships, as it appears in my little representation there. Essentially, this type of radiality stands for foregrounding of other than ego, while ego is relegated in the background. And now you start seeing, if as Polynesianists and Oceanists, that the issue of foregrounding other compared to ego, it's a very common characteristic throughout Polynesia and oceanic, on the oceanic world. Okay? Socially, linguistically, it's a different story. Culturally too. So the conceptual content of radiality is a point, vectors, and point two. The logical syntax of radiality is other than ego, vector, ego, relevance of the sequence. So the other than ego starts first. Okay? I demonstrated that in 2009, the radiality participated in the construction of a number of Tongan domains like space, time, possession, traditional belief system, traditional navigation, kinship, and social relationships. Can radiality play a role in the mental construction and the linguistic expression of quality? That's a big question here. I mean, it has been already shown to participate in a number of domains. Can it play a role in quality as well? The strategy to detect such a participation is embedded in the fundamental difference that is drawn between primary and secondary quality distinction. I hypothesize that the focus on primary quality distinction could be an indication of radiality having such a role. So, primary and secondary distinction. We'll see what that means. The distinction between primary and secondary quality indexes a focus on intrinsic quality of object, other than ego, when primary quality distinctions are expressed. Thus, if a preference for expressing primary qualities is detected, it can be interpreted as a contribution of the foundational cultural model of radiality, whose focus is other than ego, and is central, as a central characteristic of radiality itself. And this could be contributing to the construction of the quality domain. It is then the detection of such a preference that informs most of the research projects presented in this work. Preliminary result, of course. Second issue, Tongan and adjective. I accepted the idea that there are adjectives in Tongans, and they are in the Church Word Dictionary. There are Tongan English Dictionary under 59. The Church Word decided to call things a set of words, let's say lexeme, to call them adjectives. So I say, okay, even if this may not be the case, still you must have experienced those lexeme listed to be adjectives. And then that experience is good enough indication of adjectival status for those lexeme listed. In fact, minimally, they must have been used as adjectives in some syntactic construction for Church Word to record them as such. So then in my investigation, I'm asking these questions. Which lexeme are available to be used as adjectives, and how can they be classified? Which adjectives are preferentially used in qualifying nouns belonging to a number of domains, and how can they be classified? How do the two types of adjective cluster according to primary or secondary quality distinction, thus possibly revealing the contribution of radiality? So the pathway, there are two pathways. One is the eidetic pathway, that is to classify adjective. The other one is the emic pathway to classify adjective. It's easy to say, but it's not so easy to obtain the difference between the two. Okay. So the eidetic pathway to classify Tongan adjective, I basically looked at all the adjective in Churchward Dictionary, and there are 1,160. Okay. There are 725 which are constructed using the morpheme faca, which we have heard about today by many speakers. And faca is also used in a variety of ways. It's basically what I'm listing here is the compendium of what Liv mentioned. All the various types, they're all one type. Okay, they're all one type of prefix. So causality, be like, act, behave like, appear, look like, feel like, etc. Okay. The remaining one are 435. Then I classified only the other, not the faca compound, but according to the suggestion by a number of authors here, and a number of groups resulted. There is, authors like Arts and Dixon, and etc. etc. They gave me the possibility I combined their typology basically, and I used it for my own. And these are the groups that I obtained: physical property, personality, senses, quantity, space, dimension, feelings, etc., etc. And these are just listed in the frequency of appearance in that group of 435 that Churchward had listed. After that, I collapsed these groups into comprising adjective expressing primary or secondary qualities. And now the definition of what is a primary, what is a secondary quality, that I've used Nolan 2004, in which he says that a primary quality distinction basically a reality distinction. That is to say, there are certain qualities that object in the quote, there are certain qualities that object in the world have intrinsically, independent of our perception of them, end of quote. That is to say, they are essential property of object, intrinsic, objective, perceiver, independent. Same for secondary qualities. We have another definition, appearance distinction. That is, quote, there are certain qualities that we ascribe to object only in relation to our perceptual apparatus, end of quote. Non-essential properties of object, extrinsic, subjective, perceived, perceiver, dependent. So the primary qualities of those that I had from Churchward, of course, are quantity, dimension, and space, and they represent 20.23%. The secondary quality instead, all the other senses, physical property, personality, etc., represent the 79.77%, the rest of the adjective. So even though useful, this classification is certainly an eidetic classification. How do you obtain an emic classification? Emic pathway. Since one of my primary goals is to focus on the mental cognitive aspect of language production, I chose to use a cognitive task to answer that question. That is, I chose to use free listing or memory task to collect data. Free listing is a memory task. After all, memory holds our organized knowledge. So if you tap with a memory task, you tap into the organization of knowledge in the mind of individuals. Thus, then, one major issue arose: which nouns to use to free list adjectives that describe them? And choosing noun, I made reference to my previous research. I chose nouns in domains that I had used to investigate for the Tongan cultural model of nature, which is a comprehensive, molar cultural models. That is to say, plants, animals, humans, weather, and physical environment. In my little note there, here I say that I left out the supernatural because it's too controversial. It generates all sorts of discussion, so I just left it out. Even though I did in my other research, but not for this one, I left it out. But I also added another domain, the domain of object, human-made artifacts, because I had left it out before in my other research because it was not relevant. But here it became really relevant. And third, I selected as a representative for each domain nouns that had been determined to be the most salient from the results of free listing tasks I had already administered during my previous research. So not only I chose those domains, but I chose the most salient terms within those domains that I already had from previous research. And these are the choices that I had. So I asked this question for the free listing task. I had 13 interviews. I will read a noun and you will tell me how you would describe it to me. I selected this noun, 33 nouns: plants, animals, people, physical environment, weather, and object. And again, it's all messed up here, but it's okay. That's, you know, you have things like niu, mangu, toa, pua, nonu, etc., etc. Okay, manupuna. For example, for animals, fangamano is only mammals, so you had to add fish and birds, and so on. Okay. So this one, they all represent were nouns that were in the previous free listing task. They were the most salient, not the most salient, but were in the top 5, 10 of the list that they had given me. And then besides, my ethnographic knowledge also played a role in making some choices, okay? I always looked at the one that were most salient, but, you know, then you have 10, you cannot use 10, so you have to choose the one that you think are the most, you know, for example, I chose words that would refer to activity of women, for example, like the ike, which is the mallet that they use to make tapa, and then I also referred to the kumete, which is the bowl for kava drinking, which is typically I would say 90% male activity and things of this sort, right? So I tried to make a distribution of that. The nouns were randomized before being presented. They're not presented in various groups, like, okay, now let's talk about animals. No, they're just random, you know, all of them. The task that we recorded, the data obtained was entered in Excel worksheets and then analyzed for frequency of responses and saliency of responses. The idea is that if you have a specific words, a specific adjective in this case that appears in a list, if it is number 1 in a list of 10, it's different if it is number 1 in a list of 20. All right, so it has a different incidence, and you have to do a little statistical stuff on it, very simple things, but determines the saliency of the term across all the people that were interviewed, basically, to do this task, asked to do this task. So the result of the first set of analysis, global frequencies, and we can go very quickly about that. How many adjectives were used? We have the usage range and the clean, because I took out the repetition, and then the average. How many adjectives were used collectively? Yes, the end. Well, it's not the end for me. Sorry. I understand. You know, okay, so we just can skip about this. So I obtained around 999 adjectives. And how do they cluster according to primary and secondary distinction? So you have, I have some kind of elimination process, and this is the methodological issue. So first I eliminated the adjective that we use only once. So to eliminate the possibility that idiosyncratic use, okay? And then I eliminated the multi-words adjective, what I call, you know, it's very common when people give you adjective, that instead of giving one adjective, they give you a whole phrase or clause, you know, and then that is okay, you know, you accept it, but then when you want to count real adjective, you have to take it out. The other thing, I eliminated typical noun, and this typical noun and typical verbs, and this took a long time. It took a long time with my graduate assistant, who's Tongan, and also when I went back to the field, I asked people to verify that. So basically, the impression of, okay, I give you this word, what do you think it is? And they say, okay, they give an example in a sentence, or they say it's a noun or whatever. So I had to do that. It took a long time, but it allowed me to reduce the number of terms, of lexeme that were typically adjective and not typically nouns or verbs. The other thing is they obtained is that there are 53 new adjectives compared to church word, basically. And maybe because we made some mistake in going through the dictionary and counting them, I mean, or because some were not recorded by church word. Some that people use new ones that they are not used before. And then I classify them according to primary or secondary distinction, and you get primary distinction, 27-50%, secondary distinction, 72-5. Now you start seeing where I'm going. I mean, the differences in percentages in frequency. how do this emic result compare with those of the ETIC classification? The FACA words, okay, they're less, of course, much less. The primary is higher, 27.5, and the secondary is a little lower. And if you just look at the frequency of at the number of adjective used, not at the individual adjective that was used and then repeated, and then I calculated only one. But if you have the same adjective used 10 times, calculated 10 times this time, then you have a completely different percentages. You have primary 41% and secondary 58%. Then we looked at the saliency analysis because of the basic assumption, first remembered, mentioned, more salience. Free listing result indicate most cognitive salience member obtained list. And most salient adjective can be determined, for example, for an individual noun, or for a group of nouns, or for all of them, okay? And then after that, you can look again into the primary, secondary distinction. So, very quickly, for the coconut for Neo, it was 31.8% primary, okay, with all this process of eliminating all the words that I as already mentioned. For plants, we have 32.88%, okay, of primary terms. A new comparison here. Okay, this is something that we can skip, but the other one is very important. You have the ETIC result is 20% and it stays like that, but for Neo it goes 31.8, for plants 32.8, for all primary quality distinction times used it was 41.16, and for plants top 12 salient primary 58.33 are primary terms. And I chose the top 12 of the list because after 12, the frequency of incidents start going down, okay? So I choose the top 12 for all the various terms. I also have the various, I'm not gonna look at, I'm gonna talk about this, but I have for each individual group that I did the frequency. So, in the end then, it appears that my hypothesis, the mental representation and the linguistic expression of quality distinction are affected by the cognitive presence for radiality, is starting to find some preliminary support, especially by considering the evidence presented that adjectives expressing primary quality distinction are more frequently used in free listing tasks. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. S'il y a quelqu'un qui a une question, juste une question, et après, du coup, on va diriger.
Yeah, one question, but we can also, I am open to talk after, you know, dinner or whatever. Yes, Anna.
Thank you. A comment and a question, so I get away with that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, never mind.
At least one person.
I'll just give you the comment. I find it really helpful to look at to keep distinct the function and the word class. And you kind of semi-did that, but not really. So it would be helpful to talk about lexical modification as a function versus adjectives as a word class. So you semi-did that by tracking out the FACA-derived ones, but then you didn't look at the rest in terms of how do their pattern, how are they different from verbs, are they different from verbs? So I think it would be strengthening your study if you kept, in terms of terminology, kept lexical modification separate from a word class of adjectives,
right,
and then go a step beyond just excluding the FACA ones, the derived ones, and look at the word class in a morphosyntactic sense and reserve adjectives for that kind of category.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I think it is, I have three comments to myself. And it is, and it is one that is exactly what you said. I mean, basically to work a little more on the distinction between the adjective, noun, and verbs and modification and things like that. That's something that needs to be done, and I will do it. The other one is also the comparative part. I mean, when I did the EDIC and the church word, that's not enough, because yes, I am assuming that they, basically what I'm assuming is that the tertiary dictionary represents the potential knowledge of adjectives for Tongans, right? But that is not the case, you know. So I would have what I'm planning to do is to go into the field and collect possibly knowledge about adjective, and starting from tertiary, but just see, do you really know this word, you know, that tertiary mentioned, you know, or is just not? And it's going to be a long time process. So in order that the comparison, one of the terms for the comparison would be a little more, let's say, contemporary, a little more emic, a little more real, because my assumption is that, okay, the tertiary one is the potential knowledge, but it's an assumption, I mean, because we don't know what they have. And I stop there because I have other comments about myself too. But I mean, that's why I came here, because I wanted to basically interact with oceanic expert about.
Because otherwise we will reconsider the tomato.
No, please don't throw tomatoes at the speakers. He may collapse dead. All right, thank you.